It's called the medical device industry. But people don't buy devices. People don't buy technology. They buy products. Build it, crank it out, and let the market tell you. I think that is fatally flawed in medtech. I have 9 months to do something risky, which is totally the opposite of, I think, how most logical people think of that.
When you're building something new, the instinct is to lock it down, define the requirements, build the thing, and ship it. Eric Sugalski has spent his entire career arguing that that's exactly how you build the wrong product. Eric learned that lesson early, first at IDEO, one of the most legendary design firms in the world, and then spending 15 years running his own company, helping founders turn raw health technologies into products that actually work for the people who use them. Along the way, he helped develop everything from an artificial womb for premature babies to a wearable airbag that catches you when you fall. Now, he's sold that company and is building his own medical device for the first time. This is the story of what happens when the person behind everyone else's products finally steps out on his own. Eric, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Yeah, it's great to be here, David. Thanks for the invite.
I think there are so many different stories that might highlight the beginning of your career. And I'm so curious, when you look back on all the things you've done and those early life experiences, where does your big story start for you?
So for me, my big story started at my first job out of undergrad. And I was really fortunate to land a job with this company called IDEO. You know IDEO, they're in your neck of the woods. But it's sort of a really innovative organization that does design for a whole different, a number of different industries, including medical products, consumer products, different kinds of environments. And so, coming at kind of things from a very analytical end, being an engineer by training, I got into this very creative world where there were people on staff, that came from the anthropology background or from psychology or cognitive science or industrial design, and pulling all of these different disciplines together into this one setting for me was really illuminating. And it kind of exposed me to not only all of the different disciplines and people that could contribute to innovation, but also just, kind of the process of how to go from that kernel of an idea into something that's a bit more formalized, and how to kind of think through the de-risking process with users and with other stakeholders. For me, that was kind of the launching pad of my career, and it was my dream job, and I was so stoked that I landed that at the beginning stages of my career.
Such a neat place. I often think of seeing IDEO for the first time and people who have their first exposure to the world of IDEO as kind of being like that moment in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory where he first gets to the curtains lifted and he sees this magical space. You talk about IDEO being a real dream job for you. You had a light bulb moment when you first heard about IDEO, and I'd love if you could share what that was like and what it was that excited you for the first time that carried you through to being thrilled to be there for your very first job.
Yeah, there were a couple of things. First, when I was a senior in college, this was going back into 1999, so pre-2000, but my professor at the time showed this video of IDEO, and I think it's still in distribution today. People are still seeing the infamous shopping cart video where, sitting in senior design and having, my prior background and coursework focused on thermodynamics and fluid mechanics and statics and solids and all of these very kind of analytical things. When I saw that shopping cart video, I was just like, whoa, this is amazing. Like, there are people that get to do this for a living. And so, I was very fortunate because I went to my professor, who knew somebody that worked at IDEO and was actually a former student. And that individual was the head of the Chicago office. So he said, Eric, you should talk to this other person. And one thing led to another. That turned into an internship. And when I flew out there for the first time, it was just kind of the epitome of creative culture, kind of an open floor plan and just a lot of whiteboards and brainstorming and it was sort of chaotic in a way, but like kind of organized chaos, if that makes any sense. Like it was, they had a structure and a way of kind of taking all of these different disparate ideas and kind of formalizing that process into something that resulted in like consistent creative outputs that were valuable. And so I kind of fell in love with the process and with the place and For me, it was maybe those two things were light bulb moments, the, in-office experience and then that first shopping cart video way back.
And that shopping cart video, for folks listening who aren't familiar, I remember that video as being like a segment on the nightly news where they basically showed some designers walking into a grocery store and looking at shopping carts and saying these could be so much better. Is that how you remember it?
Yeah, yeah, it was, I forget who the newscaster was. It was like Nightline or something like that, but it was a big mainstream broadcast, and they went into a shopping cart with this idea of like, let's take something that is age old and that's been used for, decades and hasn't really changed, and let's turn it into something that is ready for the modern day. You look back at that shopping cart video now and it kind of feels a little dated, but at the time it was really inspiring to kind of think about how could you transform this thing that everybody uses on a regular basis into something that was really new and novel and kind of useful in a bunch of different ways.
Yeah. I'd love to look a little bit more into what that experience was like, because I have a feeling there are probably some pivotal moments that shaped the type of work you did after IDEO. What was it like to start in a project, and just walk us through what sort of the conversation was that would lead you to the type of work that you did? What would be the initial way that an idea would come to you, and then how would you sort of unpack that idea and create something that you'd hand back to your client?
So, I guess maybe I'll hit on that kind of the way that I understood it at IDEO, but then also how I think about that now, which has some common threads. One of the things that I learned at IDEO that I think is really important is the need to kind of leave the endpoint or the kind of definition of the product a little bit open ended on the front end. And so I think that a lot like people that are engineers and we want to converge very quickly. We want to write down the requirements and drill into here's what the product should be. And a lot of times we think that, if we get there quickly, then we're going to be able to make more rapid progress. But at IDEO, one of the things was let's leave those boundaries a little bit open right now and allow users and kind of the observations that we make and these other experiences to inform what the right direction of the product should be. If you lock down requirements and made those assumptions too early, you wouldn't give the design team the latitude to really to explore those other areas because you kind of have this assumption that you already know what the answer is. But the biggest challenge in product development when you're innovating and coming up with something new is recognizing that you may not know exactly what the right solution is. And the process of kind of experimenting with different solutions and taking early ideas out and testing them with users and with the market, that's the kind of process that really allows for a better understanding of where the opportunities are, the right opportunities. But I think a lot of like modern day engineering tries to shortcut that and jump into formal requirements too early. I only spent I think it was a few years at IDEO, and this was sort of a short chapter of my career, but a very very important one for me. Kind of fast forwarding to today, 20, 25 years later, I think I still firmly believe that keeping those options open and not, converging too quickly is really important. I still believe that having more of a divergent mindset when you're exploring ideas, when you're trying to really understand a problem, is probably the most critical thing that we can do as innovators, rather than just jumping into an idea and building it and thinking that this is the way that it's going to go, which is kind of like the MVP philosophy right now. Just build it, crank it out, and let the market tell you. I think that is fatally flawed in medtech. And I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but the idea is that kind of keeping those options open, talking with the market, talking with users and other stakeholders, that is a really important part of coming up with something new and making sure that you have the right solution that is going to, enter the market.
I don't think that's a tangent. I think that is such an interesting way of thinking about it, and certainly the biodesign methodology has a similar sort of visual arc to the design process. And I think of the convergence that you're talking about as sort of going broad early on, lots and lots and lots of ideas, and not trying to narrow yourself early, and then filtering down once you have all those ideas, because you may not find those unexpected surprises if you're kind of limiting your imagination early to what you assume the thing has to look like.
I totally agree. And Biodesign is one of those books on my shelf right there that's probably one of the most frequently referenced books. So I agree that that process is captured very, very nicely, and I think allows for that creative freedom early on in the process, and has the right filters in place to make sure that you're getting the right questions answered, and you're making the right assumptions before converging too early.
Eric, I'd love to fast forward to what I see as kind of one of the next big chapters in Eric's life when I think of the movie of Eric. And I'd love to hear about what it was like when you were teaching at MIT, and you've spoken publicly before about this light bulb moment. Maybe it was a slow, gradual light bulb, or all of a sudden, but when you were sort of walking around seeing all these neat things that people were building in labs, but you saw a disconnect between that and getting out into the real world. Tell me more about what was going on.
I had a lecturer role at MIT for, I think, 3 or 4 years, and I was a lab instructor in senior design. So I wasn't really teaching a lot of coursework, but I was working with students in their senior design with the product development process. And it was an amazing experience. There was a great professor that was leading that course, and I was so lucky to have had that experience. But like you said, when I was there on campus, I had the opportunity to start to network with some of the other researchers and other professors that were there doing amazing things in the labs. And one of the things that I realized was that these world's experts in very narrow scientific areas, they oftentimes maybe didn't have the skill set that was needed to translate that into something that was more market focused. That was kind of my background. I wasn't really this scientific expert, but I had this experience and this skill set that allowed me to take these early ideas and shape them into things that were more useful, and kind of use that process that we just talked about to kind of understand user needs and understand different risk factors, and try to turn those technologies into products. That was what started my company, which was called Boston Device Development at the time, was working with these technical innovators at places like MIT to kind of translate those early technologies into products that were much more market focused.
Eric, I think it's interesting that you not only made this observation that there is this disconnect between the really incredible ideas and technologies and sort of getting out into the world, but that once you started Boston Device Development, it sounds like you were oversubscribed for business pretty early. Sounds like it was a true unmet need that was in the market. Is that fair to say?
I think that, for me, like, I chose a very narrow niche. So I was, coming from the design services space. I was at IDEO, and then I was with another company called Insight Product Development. They were kind of very general firms catering to a lot of different industries. And what I decided to do was to go very narrow, and so focus on one specific sector of the market, which was technology innovators that wanted to get their technologies turned into businesses. Now, there's a lot more of that now than there was, like 15 years ago when I was kind of getting going with Boston Device. And so at the time, it was definitely a little sliver of a market, and it was an area where I was able to kind of connect with the right people and get some things going. But it was also initially just me. I just kind of bootstrapped things and got things going. So I was able to keep myself busy with that type of work, and then eventually start to hire some other people to expand the skill sets, expand the capabilities and the horsepower of the firm.
What was that like starting a company like that all on your own?
So for me, it was I've always, when I was younger, I kind of always had this vision that I was going to start my own company. And I think the thing that prompted me to do this is that my wife and I found out that we were expecting. So I thought of that as like, okay, I have 9 months to do something risky and get out there, which is totally the opposite of, I think, how most logical people think of that, as more of, okay, now it's time to, to settle down and do something more conservative. But for me, I was kind of looking at that as, okay, this is my timetable. This is my window where I get to, go out and try to make a go of this, because after our first baby comes, then it's going to be a lot more difficult to do something more risky. And so for me, that was the launching pad that got Boston Device moving.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's funny when they talk about constraint being the real gasoline for innovation. It's almost like you kind of forced yourself to make a big leap and have it work.
Yeah, that's true. I think constraint is a big part of innovation, and for me, that's that 9 month period of time was definitely the constraint that I needed to get out and do it.
What were some of those early projects like? Do any specific ones come to mind?
One of the first projects was this MIT spin out called Lantos Technologies. And this was it was a technology that was in the labs at MIT. This pretty renowned professor had this technology that would image or scan very small cavernous spaces. And so, they had one very successful application of this technology in the dental space, and so they thought, what other part of the body can we scan with this, unique imaging technology? And so they converged on the ear canal in order to kind of digitize the process of creating these casts of your inside of your ear. And so Lantos was one of those first projects that I worked on as Boston Device, and it was great because the team was very open to talking with audiologists and taking early prototypes out and getting feedback in order to figure out what the right direction was. Now, there was a push from like some of the engineering people, within the lab to build the MVP. Let's get something working and get it usable and march it towards the manufacturing. But there was also tolerance for us, kind of exploring some of these other directions that were much more uncertain, different form factors or different use cases. Rather than this being a kind of a small pen-like device, maybe it deserved to be, like a piece of ophthalmology equipment or something where it's more of a benchtop fixture. Or how do people think through stabilization and charging and all of these other things that sometimes get kind of brushed to the side when you're just laser focused on getting something into the market. And so what we were able to do in that project was recruit a number of different audiologists, present to them, 5 or 6 different configurations of the products, all of which were effectively just non-functional props, right? They were just, usability mock-ups that allowed us to get something in the hands of users and allow them to tell us what was working and what wasn't. And so we had a mannequin that they were using to kind of simulate how these products could be used in the real world. And we learned so much from that, kind of stage of directional research where we weren't going in with one concept. We went in with, 5 or 6, and kind of the mix and match that happens and sort of the forced ranking that allows you to understand why people like certain things and why they dislike others. That was exactly the information that we needed to land in the final direction of the product. And so with that information and with that feedback, we had so much more confidence that what we were building was going to resonate with target users.
It makes me think of what folks call works like prototype versus a looks like or feels like prototype. And it sounds like there's such rich information that you were able to draw from something that kind of looks and feels like the real thing, even if it's not functionally doing the job yet.
Yeah, I think actually sometimes it's even more useful to have something that is non-functional when you're early.
Mm.
Because when you get, something that is functional, then people are focused exactly on like the precision of the instrument or, the accuracy or the sort of the technical details. And that those things are important. But if you have something functional too early, then that's where the focus goes. Whereas a lot of the other aspects are just as important. Where's this thing going to be stored? Or does it need to be wireless or plugged in? All of those other questions are really important for the success of the product, but sometimes they get kind of pushed to the side if you're just laser focused on the technical aspects.
This makes me think of I'm going to date myself here, but PDAs or personal digital assistants, or
Oh yeah,
I
like the
forget.
Palm Pilot.
The Palm Pilot. And
Yeah.
I heard a story once that either the inventor of the Palm Pilot or one of the early investors carried around a wood block that was the exact size of the Palm Pilot and just sort of had it in his shirt all day, or when he wanted to remember or look something up the way he would with this imagined device at that time, he would take this chunk out just to kind of get a feeling for what the experience might be. And it's so interesting hearing you point out that the lack of functionality is really a key part, because you must be so much more careful and ginger handling this delicate piece of technology than you would be with this throwaway chunk of wood that you're just sort of getting a feel for.
Yeah, that's so true, and I know exactly the prototype that you're referencing. The beauty is he could always have it in his pocket and pull it out, and there it was, the prop that he could use to get feedback on. So I agree. I mean, I think that sometimes the usability aspects and kind of the practical, like just imagining what if this product were real. You know, it doesn't work right now, but what would be some of your questions and concerns if this did work? That can be much more illuminating into understanding people, like how does this fit into somebody's workflow, or all of the other questions that we just talked about. Where does it fit? How's it charged? You know, all of those things come about when you have something physical, but your focus is not just on the technical aspects.
Eric, you have this really beautiful way of talking about technology as transformation. And I know that that was one of the key words that you had front of mind when you rebranded to the name Smithwise at one point for your company. I would love to hear more about what you were thinking of and what that word means for you in light of what you've been doing.
The idea of, where I started was really on the working with these technical innovators. And there's maybe a couple of layers of transformation that we can try to unpack here. Well, the first is the product or the technology. You know, a lot of times engineers and professors in different technical schools, we're focused on devices, right? And the technology, but people don't buy devices, right? People don't buy technology. They buy products, right? They buy things that are shaped for the market. And that's one of the challenges that I think we have in this industry. It's called the medical device industry, right? Like device is in the name of the industry, but people don't buy devices. They buy things that can help them achieve outcomes, right? And so for me, one of the goals is how do you transform that technology that might have something interesting and relevant for the market into a product that people are willing to buy and willing to use. And so that's the transformation process that I think about, and what goes into that is a lot more than just reliability and testing and kind of the functional aspects. It's the transformation of thinking through, well, how does how does regulatory play a role? How does workflow play a role? How does unit economics play a role? Like all of these pieces are critical, to think through as you're transforming from that technology into a final product that's ready for the market. That's, I guess, one layer of transformation that I think is important. But the other is transforming from like a mindset of when you're an engineer, or when you're a clinician, or somebody from a technical or tactical background, oftentimes we just want to build something. We just want to get something in the hands of people so that you can show them how valuable this thing is. But I think that there's a transformation that's needed in like our mindsets when we go from that technical entrepreneur into more of a business operator. And it's getting a better awareness of all of these other pieces that are usually not part of our training. Like engineers are not taught about, the sales process and about getting into the heads of users and how to interview and all of these other things. But that's where, the most valuable pieces of information often come from. And so there's that transformation of like going from kind of what as a technical practitioner into being somebody that's a little bit more of a open-minded entrepreneur that is willing to search for the no's instead of the yeses. Look for all of the reasons why your idea or your technology may not be the right fit, right? And so there's a shift and a transformation that needs to take place there as well.
Since we're talking about it, I'm curious as you reflect on your own career now, what has your personal transformation been across this chapter?
So many. I mean, I think I've had different stages of transformation. For me, that there's the one that I just mentioned, being an engineer and getting hired to build these things. I had to go through that transformation of understanding all of these different parts of building a product that were important. I'd say there was also another transformation around going from the engineer to being like the person that was managing engineers, and that was a hard transition for me, and still is in many ways, because I think that most technical founders, put myself in this bucket. We we get into the business because we're good at a certain skill, right? Where for me, I was good at design, and I could build things. I was just wired for it, right? It's kind of a gearhead,
Hmm.
and that got me into this domain of being being an engineer. But that doesn't necessarily port over very well to managing others that are doing that. And sometimes there's this tension that exists where your new job, you may have transformed, or I may have transformed into this person that had 10 engineers that were in the company that I needed to try to keep busy and collaborate with. But I had this tension because I wanted oftentimes to be that engineer that was still doing the building, because that was the fun stuff, right? And so there was this transformation that I had to take from being the builder to being, I guess, the business builder, not the product builder, but the business builder. And that was hard, and still is, because in my heart, and like the day-to-day stuff that I love doing, I still love, just getting into problem solving. Sometimes when you're building a business, it's less about that. It's more about spreadsheets and administrative tasks and contracts and all these things that were not the reason that you started this company to begin with. So there is a transformation that often needs to take place when you're growing a company, and when you're maybe changing roles throughout your career.
It's so interesting because while you're sharing this tension and maybe even a drop of frustration having to sort of watch the fun stuff and be in charge of the bigger picture, I can't help but thinking you did this for 15, 16 plus years, kind of helping people build their technology and bring these dreams into real clinical use. But now you're doing that yourself with Ampulus. I'd love to know how you decided that this is the thing that you were going to build, and I'd love to hear more about this story that started to open up.
What happened with Ampulus, let me kind of take a couple of steps back. The company that started as Boston Device, and then changed into Smithwise, that rebrand that you mentioned, went through a merger, and later became a company called Archimedic. Now, I ran Archimedic and sort of this collection of entities for 15 years. I was CEO of the company throughout that transformation. And I sold Archimedic in 2024. But before I sold Archimedic, I wanted to take a couple of things with me. And one of those things were some technologies or IP that had been developed that I'd been working on, and some others had been working on in the drug delivery space. And so I carved that out as part of this transaction, and I kind of had this idea of, okay, now I'm gonna try to build this startup myself, and get things moving there. That's the genesis of Ampulus. So Ampulus is really around trying to solve problems specifically around reconstitution of drugs. So you may be familiar with how many drugs are stored in a lyophilized, kind of powder-based format, right? Because of stability improvements, and that's the main reason why they're lyophilized. But when you have to,
And just for folks who aren't familiar with lyophilization, you make it super cold, you apply a vacuum to suck the liquid out, and you get sort of the powdered version that can then be reconnected with liquid to form its liquid form. Is that fair to say?
yeah, I think that's a good description. So through that process of like you said, evaporating the liquid component, you dehydrate the drug or biologic into a powdered base form. But therein lies the challenge. Before this drug gets back into its format where it's able to be injected, you need to introduce a diluent. And so you need to combine that diluent in with the drug. You need to agitate it. Now, most of the time, this is done through manual process. You have the drug is stored inside of this vial. You have the diluents. It's in a separate vial. You have a series of syringes, and you have to go back and forth and mix. And inevitably, there are challenges and dosing errors that happen. There's a lot of time that's wasted in this process. This takes place in hospitals where you have nurses and doctors that are able to do this much more efficiently, but many medications are moving into the home as well. So many of these injectable solutions now need to be handled by users, and to ask them to go through this process of mixing the lyophilized powder with the diluent, it's risky. And so what we're what we're trying to do with Ampulus is make that process a lot easier. And so we're developing new drug delivery solutions that just have one step where you basically are removing a cap, and then automatically that diluent combines in with the lyophilized powder, and it's ready to be injected. So it's trying to simplify that process to make it more efficient, to make it safer, more reliable for clinicians that are healthcare professionals that are doing this, as well as for people that are doing this process at home.
It's funny as you're describing the process of mixing it and reconstituting. I think of there are different agents that we use in the operating room sometimes for hemostatics or material that we can apply to sort of slow down bleeding when it's oozing, not like a squirting vessel, but just sort of a raw surface. And it's like watching a little chemistry lab in the back table when someone in the operating room is responsible for bringing this up for us to bring in the surgical field. There's the one syringe and the other syringe in the mixing chamber and going back and forth. And so what you're describing sounds like a really beautiful way to avoid all of this manual labor and labor that must have a certain amount of lost material and waste. And I can totally see how the dosing challenges might play into it also.
Yeah, definitely exists in the operating room and emergency medicine and oncology, all different parts of healthcare are using these types of drugs. In fact, I forget the exact number, but of a large percentage of new regulated drugs, the drugs that are being approved now are lyophilized. So like high volume biologics, for instance, many of them need to be in this lyophilized format. So this is a challenge that exists now, and I think it's only going to get greater. So we need to come up with better solutions on how to handle the mixing and of the diluent and the lyophilized powder.
This is obviously a big challenge as you've laid out just the sheer numbers and the volume. It's also a really nuanced unmet need that is not obvious. It's not something that would pop up on a Google search. Curious how you came across this unmet need, and a step further, how folks who are innovators or want to be innovators can find really unique opportunities that are unmet needs.
It took a few turns, if I'm being honest. The company Ampulus started out doing something that is very different than what I just described with the reconstitution. It's called Ampulus because the idea started out where you have a lot of drug that's contained inside of hermetically sealed glass vials, or called ampules, right? And so ampules are used in certain types of medicine in the U.S. They're used much more broadly in overseas. But one of the great things about them is that there's because they're hermetically sealed, there's no air or contaminants that can get in or out of that ampule. It's all glass, right? So the drug or the drug is only exposed to the glass material. But one of the challenges that you have with ampules is the glass and the particulate that comes with the glass, right? You have to break the ampule, and then you have to get it into a syringe. And most of the time people are using filters in order to try to filter out the glass particulate, but sometimes that's missed. And so, in cases like that, you can get glass particulate into an injectable drug, which is, for obvious reasons, not a good thing. And so the initial thought was, well, why don't we kind of leverage the benefit of these ampules and get it into a format that is closer to injectable, and it already has that glass filter inside of it, and so you can't forget to apply that glass filter; it's always there. And so that's one of the configurations that started. Now, I mentioned that because we went through a number of conversations, and I had these conversations with different pharma partners and people in healthcare. And what I learned through that process early on is that, here in the U.S., there's an aversion to ampules, and it's almost perceived as kind of antiquated technology. And because of some of these things that I just mentioned, like the glass particulate. And so there's a trend moving away from ampules. And so I learned about that, and decided, okay, maybe it makes sense for us to shift into a different drug delivery problem. And so we leveraged some of the same kind of configuration of the product, but recognized that it also had a lot of application in reconstitution. Maybe just going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, where before locking down onto a problem or a particular solution, kind of being open to all of the reasons why it may not be the right direction to pursue. While I do think that there is still an application for that ampule-based pre-filled syringe, I heard enough from the market to suggest that the reconstituted version should probably play a higher priority in the near term. So that's a little bit of a roundabout answer to your question.
Roundabout, but really practical, because I think it's so interesting how there's a kind of wobbly path to get to the final the final target sometimes, and you kind of need those wobbles to figure out the best way forward.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So what's next for Ampulus? I'm curious what's on the radar for the future.
So it's still early. I'm in conversations with pharma partners. Really, a product like this has its primary value when it's packaged with the drug, right? And so the only way that can happen is if we have a pharma partner or several that are adopting this technology and using it as their platform for reconstitution. So I'm early in conversations with different pharma partners and trying to identify the right ones to move forward with. And then after that, those agreements are in place. There's going to be some updates to the product, adapting for specific use cases and getting the combination products ready for clinicals and regulatory filings and the like.
Mm. You also sit now as an angel investor in Robinhood Ventures, and I'm curious, are there experiences or conversations that you have on that side of the table that you find yourself flowing back into how you think as a founder right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say that for me, the greatest benefit of being part of Robinhood so far, I haven't had any. I've only been with the group for about 2.5 years, and so there haven't been any exits for me personally. But I've learned an enormous amount just from sitting on the investor side of the table and hearing from all of the other investors. There's 80 total members in Robinhood, so a solid group of well-rounded investors that cross over into all of these different sectors of various industries. Being on that side of the table and listening to the questions that these other investors are asking of the entrepreneurs, it's been so valuable to helping me understand all of the risk factors and how investors see, these issues and challenges with early stage medtech companies. So it's definitely informing how I will go about the process differently in the future as an entrepreneur. It's valuable to kind of get that investor take.
Over the years, you have helped shape so many different technologies and projects, and I'm curious, are there a couple that stand out as something that you're particularly proud of, that you maybe particularly enjoyed doing?
Sure. When I think about the products that I'm most proud of, some of them are based on the impact that I think these products are going to have. Some of that, the reasons why the products are meaningful for me are because of maybe the process that we went through. But I do want to recognize that my role in most of the projects at Archimedic and otherwise was really one part of the process, right? And so there were a number of other engineers and designers that were contributing to these things, probably in just as much, if not more so than I was personally. But two that come to mind for me. One was when I was working with Children's Hospital of Philadelphia for many years in this premature gestation system, gestation system for extremely premature infants. So kids that are born at 24, 26 weeks of gestation, where their lungs aren't developed. When they're born at that age, they face incredible challenges because of that lung incapacity, and it results in neurological delays and other challenges. Whereas if that gestation can extend for just 4 weeks, the gains that can be realized through that 4 week additional period of time are amazing. And so, kids, most of them that are born at 28, 30 weeks are they can live a normal healthy lives, but that's not often the case for kids that are born at 24, 25 weeks. What this was is basically a system that allowed these babies to go into this compartment. It gets filled with a synthetic amniotic fluid. Their umbilical cord gets cannulated and basically is used as an oxygenation circuit. It's kind of replicating the placental and uterine function in an artificial environment. And the babies live in this aquatic environment for another 30 days. And so this is not fully commercial or even clinical yet. When I was working on this, it was preclinical. So doing a lot of testing on the bench and with animal models in order to evaluate the safety and of this system and to prove it out. I played a role during the earlier stages of kind of building out the architecture and the use case of this product, and I was fortunate to work with some of the world's best surgeons in this area. And so for me, that was a project where I feel like that potential for amazing impact there. And it was also just a really technically interesting project as well, where you had all of these different components coming together, the chemistry, the fluidics, the thermals, the electronics, the mechanical systems. Like from an engineering perspective, there's a lot to figure out there. But I think clinically, and when you think about changing somebody's life, this is, kind of at the top of the list for me. So that was one. Another one that is commercial now, I worked on this project with a company called Active Protective. And so this is a product that's intended for people, elderly population that might be prone to fracturing their hips through a fall. And so, most people have somebody in their life that's experienced a hip fracture. And, most people realize the downward spiral that occurs after that. It's tragic when you see that happen. So this company, Active Protective, it was founded by an orthopedic surgeon who was, fixing all of these hips after they'd already been broken. And he thought, well, I want to try to prevent these hip fractures from occurring in the first place. And so he, came up with this idea of it was basically a wearable device that had a gas cylinder built in, an electronics package that was looking at motion patterns, and if it detected a fall, then it would rapidly deploy this gas into bladders that were surrounding the hips and cushioning the landing. That has now transformed into a product that's more of a belt that people would wear, and it has that same airbag technology inside of it. The company recently went through a clinical study and got amazing results. They went through the de novo pathway. They're now on the market, and I think they're having really great success. So that was another project where I was kind of involved at the earlier stages, and it was a project where it's really important to get in the heads of users, right? Like the two big questions with this product are, will it work, right? So will it prevent people from getting hip fractures? But then the second is, are people going to wear it? Because if they're not going to wear it, it doesn't really matter how well it works. And so we had to step into the lives of people that would be expected to use this product day in and day out, and at nighttime too, because that's when a lot of the falls occur. And so we interviewed a number of people in nursing homes, assisted living facilities, people living independently at home, and really understood their concerns with the product, some of the the opportunities that they saw, and so it was through that process that I think we landed on the right architecture, the right configuration and use case for the product. So those were two projects that really kind of stood out in my career as being pretty important ones.
Both seem so far-reaching at such different ends of the lived experience of the journey of life, at the
Yeah,
very beginning,
true.
or even before the beginning, and sort of later in life. Eric, for students listening, or really anyone that wants to get into the world of innovation that is sort of dazzled by everything you've done so far, what is your advice to someone who maybe has an idea, maybe has something sort of back of the napkin, or maybe doesn't even know what their idea is going to be and just wants to step into this world. What do you tell those folks?
I think I've been working with bioengineering students for many years, and teaching in different settings. And one of the challenges that I think comes up time and again from people that are students or earlier on in their careers is the tendency to rely on secondary information. So, internet searches or now AI, it's becoming more and more prevalent where people will just do secondary research in order to find the answers to what they're looking for. But my best advice for people that want to innovate and want to build something that is really important is to maybe use that secondary research to kind of get a baseline, but then put it to the side and step into primary research, and which is talking with individuals, face to face, and doing observations and seeing how the standard of care works right now. I'll say that that is the one thing that is really challenging for the smartest of the smart students to do. Because we're so wired to try to get to the answer and converge on the solution quickly, to kind of open ourselves into more of this mode of inquiry is a challenge for a lot of people. But it's so important. It's so important to entrepreneurship, to innovation, to kind of put AI aside and focus more on what is a day in life like for the person that has to deal with this condition, or the physician that has to use this piece of equipment in the OR, or whatever it might be. There's nothing that can really substitute for that, that primary research. And I think that's where, the most important innovations come about.
Wow. Eric, this has been such a special conversation. I'm so grateful for your time.
It was fun. Enjoyed chatting with you, David. Thank you.